On today's show, I want to run through the rehab progress for Deshaun Watson and Nick Chubb, where they're at, what we know most importantly, and when we can expect them to see them back on the field at 100%. So let's start with Deshaun Watson, and then we'll get to Nick Chubb. So I feel like a good starting point is let's go over the injury timeline for Deshaun Watson. Right from the beginning, which was September 24th against the Tennessee Titans, where he took a hit going on a quarterback run, injured his right rotator cuff. We saw him miss the following few weeks, and then ultimately the Ravens game, November 12th, although he says later on that maybe he even broke that bone earlier, but we'll stick with November 12th for right now. He suffers a right glenoid fracture in his throwing shoulder, and he gets surgery on November 21st. Now, the November 21st date is I would say, most important date of all three of these because that's when the rehab begins, right? Anytime you hear a player give an estimated time that they have to rehab before they can come back to the field, the court, the ice, whatever, it all starts after the surgery date, which here is November 21st. Now, a quick reminder that Deshaun Watson's injury was very unique and unusual, right? He did not break a shoulder or like rotator cuff or separated shoulder. No, he suffered a slight fracture on his glenoid bone, which is not common. We don't see that happen very often at all with quarterbacks. So there's not a precedent, and that's very important. Now, the glenoid fracture recovery time, based on the 30 minutes of WebMD research I did to try and find one, was limited because it's not an injury that's very common with athletes, but B, around 6 months. I feel like if it's 4 to 6 months, if you're a really good athlete like Deshaun Watson is, you should expect it to be closer to 4 than 6. But at the same time, if your job is to throw a football with your shoulder, and that's where the fracture was, it may take a little bit longer for that person to get back to full health. Whereas if it's a plumber who had a right glenoid fracture, they can probably go back to work a lot easier. Not the same for a quarterback. But like I said, there's no precedent on quarterbacks having a fractured glenoid. So we can't look at other quarterbacks who dealt with this injury and saw, well, they came back in 6-7 months. That gives us a timeline for Deshaun Watson. Now, Watson was a bit of a trailblazer with this injury. So let's fast forward in the timeline now. Really, the first time we saw Deshaun Watson after he got surgery on November 21st was at the Browns-Rams game, where Twitter got really, really mad because Deshaun Watson wasn't on the field despite wearing a sling. So that was really impactful in that Browns-Rams game. I'm sure they would have won it if Watson was on the sideline with a tablet in his hand. But that was the first time we saw Watson following the surgery, okay? Fast forward a little bit later, we get another peek at him December 28th. This is the home Thursday night game against the New York Jets, and Deshaun Watson is on the field, there you go, everyone on Twitter, with no sling. So November 21st surgery to December 28th, so 5 weeks later, he is on the field with no sling, which is definitely a good sign of the recovery and the rehab going as planned and on schedule, and maybe even a little bit ahead of schedule. I mean, I'm no expert when it comes to shoulder recoveries, but being out of a sling 5 weeks after surgery, that can't feel like it's very far behind schedule, if at all. Now, let's move on to the next time we heard an update on Watson, which was Andrew Berry speaking to the media on February 27th, saying, Deshaun will begin throwing next month. He's worked his tail off in terms of his rehab and recovery. He's in a really good place. We're excited when the spring hits and we can get him back on the field, but he's making really good progress, and we're really excited to see that continue. So that was the next big milestone in Deshaun Watson's recovery. March 21st-ish, we find out Deshaun Watson begins throwing, okay? He was working in L.A., the Browns team doctor was there, his quarterback coach Quincy Avery was there, David Njoku was catching balls and there for moral support. So around March 21, I never saw an exact date when this throwing session happened, but November 21st, he gets surgery, and then I just picked March 21st because it kind of keeps the timeline nice and clean. We are 4 months removed from surgery, and he's throwing again under some level of supervision. So safe to say, like, things are progressing nicely with a start date in September. All right, move forward a few more weeks. April 4th, and Deshaun Watson is at the grand opening of his cheesesteak restaurant, Lefties in Cleveland. He speaks to the media briefly. He tells Mary Kay that he will be ready week 1, which I know athletes in the offseason love to say that they're going to be in the best shape of their life and they're going to be ready for week 1 if they're coming off an injury. But I thought this little snippet right here was important. Deshaun Watson didn't have to say that, but he did. And I think that gave us a lot of confidence that he is on track. And then we get even more encouraging news from Andrew Berry on April 18th saying, this week Deshaun was throwing up to 40 yards. Like, he's in a pretty good spot. Again, I don't want to put the cart in front of the horse, but he's progressing as appropriate. We're really, really pleased with the work that he's put in and really pleased with how the shoulder is responding. But we're still in the middle of a rehab process. So Barry says we're in the middle of a rehab process. I think he really wants to say we're closer to the finish line than the starting line, because 6 months from November 21st, when Watson got the surgery, is May 21st. And what do you know? Just coincidentally, that happens to be the second day of Browns OTAs, and Deshaun Watson opens up OTAs throwing passes. Now, the plan is for him to throw every other day at OTAs, but as we saw in the media availability in day 2 of it, Watson was still with the first-team offense. He just wasn't physically throwing the football after taking the snap. Stefanski said he looked like himself to me. So my diagnosis of Watson's rehab and recovery is things are going swimmingly well, right? If 6 months from November 21st was the first day of OTAs, and that would be a good starting point for him to begin throwing, the guy started throwing around March 21st, 2 months before May 21st, give or take a day or two. So Watson, by my account, is definitely just not only on schedule, likely ahead of schedule in his recovery. If we use a rough 6-month timeline, which that's what the doctors online kind of give for a glenoid fracture. And again, it's not fair to say 6 months for all human beings, because Deshaun Watson is in much better shape physically than 99% of Americans. So his recovery timeline is going to be a lot different than other people's, but he also has to throw the football for a living. So he'll put more stress on that glenoid than maybe someone who is an accountant and just, types away. But I think it's crucial for Deshaun Watson to be healthy for training camp. And it definitely appears like he is on that path to walk into training camp at the end of July, early bits of August, and not be limited, but be ready to roll with the first-team offense like nothing ever happened. For a few reasons. One, Deshaun Watson historically, whether you like it or not, gets off to slow starts. Here are all of the stats from the first 4 games of his entire NFL career through all of the seasons he's played versus the next 4 games, okay? He is 7-12 historically in weeks 1 through 4. 30 touchdowns, 14 interceptions. Compared to games 5 through 8, he is 12-5, 43 touchdowns, 14 interceptions, despite playing fewer games. So from a historical standpoint, it's really important that Deshaun Watson is ready for training camp, because if he misses a lot of camp because of this injury, that's only going to make it a little bit tougher for him early on in the season when he historically already struggles in that department. But on top of that, you've got a brand new offensive coordinator in Ken Dorsey. And it's not a puppet government either, right? It's not like AVP who was running Stefanski's offense. This seems to be a much bigger collaboration between Dorsey and Stefanski. So if Watson is standing on the sideline in Berea for the first 2-3 weeks of August, and then he gets his first rep maybe, towards the end of the month, and he's well behind everyone else and picking up the new offense, and he already has a tough time early on in the season, compact that into it, and it's going to get even worse. So for me, I think it is really crucial for Deshaun Watson to be ready to roll for training camp, and it definitely looks like he is on that path. And credit to him. I mean, I've never gone through a rehab process. Sounds miserable. Everyone says it's miserable, but he is clearly putting in all the man hours to make sure he is back on the field as soon as possible. Now, what is your confidence level in Deshaun Watson this year? Scale it 1 to 10. 10 being Watson, or you believe Watson will come out and he'll throw for nearly 5,000 yards like he did in 2020. 1 being it's going to be the worst season of his NFL career. For me, I would put my confidence level at a 7.1. Like, I'm not going to get too drunk on the Kool-Aid, but I do think Deshaun Watson is going to have a really strong 2024 season. Now, we're going to talk about Nick Chubb next and where he is at in his injury rehab and progress. But really quickly, Memorial Day weekend is almost here. It's practically here. So go to chatsports.com/CLEUSA. Not too late to get yourself a Browns USA themed t-shirt. This is an awesome thing to wear on the boat, at the lake, at the beach, wherever you're going this weekend. So go to chatsports.com/CLEUSA. And it also serves as a great reminder that Memorial Day weekend is not just a weekend to get away, to go to the beach or go to the lake house, but to remember those of our great, armed forces that took the ultimate sacrifice defending our great nation. So let's talk about Nick Chubb now, because Chubb's injury is completely different, of course, from Deshaun Watson, not just from shoulder to knee perspective, but the history of Nick Chubb's knees. So September 18th, that's the Steelers game. That is when Nick Chubb tore his MCL, his meniscus, and he injured his ACL. And if you remember, later on in September, reports came out that they believed Nick Chubb did not tear his ACL, but just damaged it. And that was really encouraging. But then he got a second surgery, or got his first surgery in September 29th for the MCL and the meniscus. And then November 14th, he gets an ACL surgery. And I was never really able to dig up whether or not he completely tore his ACL or if they just had to go in and clean things up a little bit. My gut tells me, unfortunately, likely a tear if they're going in for a second surgery. But November 14th, like how Watson's kind of start date was November 21st, Nick Chubb's start date is November 14th when it comes to X amount of days away from the injury when we can expect to get him back on the field. So moving on, November 19th, we get our first look at Nick Chubb in a good amount of time. Following his second surgery, he is on crutches at the home game against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Remember, he walked out of the tunnel. They had the Batman-like intro for him on the Jumbotron. Everyone went nuts. It was awesome. The Browns won the most Steelers game ever, 13-10. But we get a look at Nick Chubb November 19th on crutches. Remember that date. December 3rd, not even 3 weeks later, Nick Chubb is off crutches. Andrew Berry would later on share a story about how Nick Chubb was in the Browns suite at the Rams game, talked about how huge the suite was, 30 yards long, and Nick Chubb got up and he went over to get some food and didn't use his crutches. And Berry's like, Nick, are you being stubborn or can you actually do this? He's like, no, I feel fine. Then they went back to Cleveland the very next day. Team doctor checks him out again. He goes, yeah, he does not need crutches anymore. December 3rd, he's off crutches. The guy got surgery, what did we say, November 14th? November 14th, that my notes have? November 14th. 3 weeks later, he's off crutches. Remarkable, okay? But it gets better. Berry, fast forward to March 29th, speaking to the media, says, honestly, it is probably too early to really understand what he's going to look like. He's truly doing a fantastic job with the rehab, and he should start to load run probably sometime this upcoming month. Then around April 13th-ish, we learn Nick Chubb begins running on land. I think it was April 18th, Andrew Berry spoke to the media, and he said, this past week, Nick Chubb began running on land. So just picked April 13th, 5 days later, for a rough estimate for when Chubb began running on land. So we go from surgery November 21st to December, January, February, March, April. About 5-ish months later, and Nick Chubb is running on land. Give him a 10-month recovery, and he's at the halfway point, and he's progressing quite well for running 5 months into a 10-month recovery, right? Had he still been on crutches or still working on the treadmill or in the water, I would say maybe things aren't progressing as nicely as the Browns would have hoped, but running on land in the middle of April for the start of the season in September, that's definitely a good sign of, okay, he's making good progress. We get some more from Berry on April 16th. I can promise you he's working very hard early in the morning. He's here. He's attacking his rehab. That's the best way I put it. When he's ready, he'll be ready. I actually think that was Kevin Stefanski that said that. Sorry about that. But regardless, if you want to use a rough 10-month recovery timeline, which is about like par for the course for ACL recoveries at this stage of modern medicine, like OBJ took pretty much a 12-month timeline recovery. But if you want to go with the 10-month recovery timeline, because Nick Chubb is just an absolute different animal when it comes to being in tip-top shape, 10 months from November 14th is September 14th. What do you know? That's right around when week 1 is. Now, my kind of gut feeling is the Browns are not going to rush Nick Chubb back at all. That's not much of a hot take to give, but the hot take I will offer is all the latest updates of the slow, I would say leakage, but updates of where he is in his rehab. I feel like the needle is pointing up. And maybe the Browns could avoid Nick Chubb going on IR to start the year. If he is on injured reserve to start the season, he misses the first 4 weeks of 2024. And remember, new rule change in the NFL this year. Teams can put players on IR in the preseason, and they're not lost for the year. Where previously, if you wanted to do that, you had to get them through roster cutdown day. The next day, you put them on IR. That opens up a roster spot, and you usually re-sign someone that you cut on roster cutdown day as long as they weren't claimed by some other team on the waiver wire. So I feel like with all the updates we've gotten on Nick Chubb, he may not be ready week 1. I don't think he will be ready week 1. Probably not week 2, but man, if the Browns could avoid putting him on IR, maybe we see him around week 3, week 4, like towards the end of September, early October. Probably, some load management, a pitch count for the first few games back, and then hopefully right around Halloween, he is running at 100%. I mean, we have seen a lot of players come back from major knee injuries like this, and it's not smooth sailing when they hit the field. Like J.K. Dobbins comes to mind. He had to get a second surgery when he came back. Last year, Broncos running back Javonte Williams, he suffered a major knee injury like Nick Chubb with several torn knee ligaments, and he came back ready to go for the first day of training camp, and he suffered his injury in October. So not too far off from when Nick Chubb suffered his. Everyone's different, but if there's a guy I want to bet on to absolutely kick rehab's ass, I'm going to go with Nick Chubb because per Kevin Stefanski, he's getting up at 5 a.m., it sounds like, every single day to get into the facility and start working out. So the moment in July when things are slow and things are dry, and there's a video of Nick Chubb at his old high school squatting 600 pounds, yeah, I'm going to be very confident Nick Chubb is going to play some football in September. Now, let's show the guys some love, though. Type 24 down below in the comment section to show Nick Chubb some support. The guy's getting up at 5 a.m. to rehab and work out to get himself back on the field as soon as possible. The least we can do is show him some love from the dog pound. All right, let's bring on Cullen Brown to pick a card. Cullen, which card would you like to go with?
I'm going to go with 4 of hearts.
4 of hearts?
4 of hearts.
Okay, I'm going to go with for Nick Chubb, 2 + 4, 6 of diamonds.
Nice.
Here we go. We were right in between. 5 of clubs. Hey, someone always picks 5 of clubs, too. It's like the second time in the last week. All right, that will do it for us on today's show. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you throughout the weekend.